All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to the keynote presentation in Colorado Center on Law and Policy's Communities Against Poverty event. This is Bob Mook. I'm CCLP's Communications Director, and I'm moderating today's presentation. Today, we are proud to host a keynote address from Mr. Tony Messenger. He's the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He's quite familiar with issues of racial equity and criminal justice through his coverage. I'm proud to say that Tony hired me for my first job in my previous life as a journalist in the early 90s. We worked together for about 5 years, and I'm absolutely delighted that our paths have crossed again for this event. Before I hand the presentation over to our Executive Director, Tiffany Lennon, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of this portion of the event. First, I'd like to thank and acknowledge our presenting sponsor, Colorado Access, and also a tip of the hat to our supporting sponsors, Center for African American Health and Connect for Health, Colorado. Next, I'd like to turn over the virtual podium to Tiffany Lennon, CCLP's Executive Director. Tiffany joined us in 2019 and has led the development and implementation of a new strategic plan and helped us to revise our mission, vision, and values. Under her leadership, CCLP is growing its mission and strengthening its commitment to racial equity, community outreach, and inclusion. You can read more about her on our website at cclponline.org. But in the interest of time, I will turn over the podium to Tiffany, who will introduce Tony Messenger. Tony will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes open for questions. You can submit your questions through either the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and I'll sort of curate those. We'll leave about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to open up for questions before wrapping up. Good afternoon, Tiffany. How are you? You're on mute, Tiffany. It takes a while.
That's a ply. Yeah.
I do it all the time. Totally understand. You ready to begin?
Yes, I am. And here I thought it was a ploy to keep me silent, Bob. But thank you, Bob. Seriously, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it is so wonderful to have all of you either returning or joining us for the first time. So thank you. I have the privilege of introducing Tony Messenger. And I always like checking out someone's Twitter handle. I think it tells a lot about a person. Here's how Tony describes himself. Metro columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Pulitzer Prize winner. Opinions expressed here are my own and they are awesome. And you know, Tony's not alone in recognizing his awesomeness, which I take as tongue in cheek. Seriously, his mentees, as Bob mentioned, colleagues and those who know him best, say he's a person of integrity, passion, and commitment. He's driven by his internal compass and by what is right. His work on debtors' prison, rural women, defendants experiencing poverty, and the poverty penalty earned him a Pulitzer Prize. He is what we refer to in the LGBT plus community as a straight ally. He uses his privilege for good. He seeks to shed light on racism, classism, and sexism that plague the US. I have gratitude for the ways in which you, Tony, use your voice and privilege. Thank you. In preparing to introduce Tony, I had the opportunity to review his written work, watch his graciousness in videos, and I have a favorite quote that I'd like to share with you. When Tony was asked by a fellow journalist who interviewed him after he won the Pulitzer, the journalist asked, "What was your favorite moment?" And here's what Tony said. I'll never forget I'll never forget the shared joy that I saw in my colleague's face when the Post-Dispatch won its 19th Pulitzer. That was the moment that stuck out to him. It was the same year that he won the Pulitzer. I will add, however, that those same colleagues shared tremendous joy with and for Tony when he won his Pulitzer. I watched a video of his announcement and they cheered him. I mean, really cheered him. Tony and others remind us that we are all lifted when one of us is lifted. We must lift each other, not because we are perfect, but because we are working towards a more perfect community, one that recognizes the tragedies of the past, the problems of the present, and a commitment to not repeat history and to make it better than any of us, frankly, could have imagined or believed was possible. Yet it will take all of us. And it is with sincere appreciation and gratitude that I introduce Tony Messenger to you. Tony?
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Bob. I really appreciate it. I am excited to be here. I wish I were in Colorado with you. Colorado is my home state. I grew up in Littleton, Colorado, graduated from Mullen High School, and several of my children and 7 of my 8 grandchildren live in Colorado. So I would have loved to be there in person, but thank you for joining this virtual event. I promise you today that I'm going to do something amid the most divided political time of my lifetime that is unifying. I want to talk to you about a topic that to me has been the most unifying thing I've written about in my career. And what I mean by that is that it is a topic that Republicans understand. It is a topic that Democrats understand, that attorneys understand, men and women, rural and urban, black and white. It is the story of the new American debtors' prisons. And I think people come to it and their understanding of it in perhaps a different way based on their own lived experiences. But so many people, since I've been writing about this story, this thread in our criminal justice system that creates this poverty penalty for so many Americans, people understand that it's wrong, that there are elements of our criminal justice system that are abusing people who are living in poverty, and we have to do something about it. My story, my connection to this topic started in about 2017 when I discovered a couple of cases in rural Missouri of people who basically had small minor offenses. They did some time in jail, and then they got out of jail and they got a bill for their time in jail. And this is the shocking part of the story, that even veteran attorneys who practice in St. Louis were shocked by, because in St. Louis, you don't get charged for your time in jail. In many places, you don't get charged for your time in jail. But in every state in the country, there is a statute that allows municipalities and counties to charge for people's time in jail. And what's happening in Missouri and in many other states, and it has happened in Colorado previously, is that people get charged for their time in jail. They get out of jail. They can't afford to pay that bill. Maybe they miss a hearing in which the judge wants them to come pay a little bit money or explain why they can't. And then they end up back in jail. And they're primarily back in jail because they're poor. So here's how it happens. Here's how the poverty penalty is applied in so many different cases to people all across America. It starts with a small mistake. You steal something. Maybe you're speeding. You might get a DUI. In almost all of the cases that I've written about since 2017 and ongoing, continuing this year in 2020, it's a mistake that is something that is a misdemeanor, a minor crime. You ending up in jail because you're poor and you can't afford it. Many of these elements of our criminal justice system in small municipalities and counties charge an amount of bail that most poor people can't afford. So they're in jail for a few days, maybe 20 days, maybe 30 days. One of the reasons that the jail time is extended in Missouri is because the public defender system is so woefully underfunded. In Missouri, it's the second least funded public defender system in the country, but this is a problem that many states have. And so they can't get access to the public defender, so they're stuck in jail. They can't even get a bond hearing. Eventually, the prosecutor comes to them and says, you know what? You don't want to be here. You need to be with your kids. You need to get back to your job. You need to take care of life. And they're like, yeah, I don't want to be in jail. What do I need to do? Sign on this dotted line. You'll just plead guilty to the crime. We'll sentence you to a year, but we'll suspend that sentence. It'll go away. It won't mean anything. And you'll be free to go. And of course, every defendant in America who's a poor person who's stuck in jail is going to take that deal. They take that deal, they get out of jail, and then they get the bill for their jail time. The story that I think really resonated with people in Missouri in the series that ended up winning me the Pulitzer Prize was a woman named Brooke Bergen. Brooke stole an $8 tube of mascara from Walmart. She was arrested for shoplifting. It was a misdemeanor. She was able to bail out of jail. And what happens in Dent County and most rural counties in Missouri, when you are able to get out on pretrial release, is that the judge still requires you to be supervised by a private probation company. Those private probation companies, which are ubiquitous all across the country, only make money if you continue to be involved in the criminal justice system. And so what happens is Brooke gets a call from the private probation company and says, you need to come in for drug testing. Now, she wasn't arrested on a drug offense, but many of the people in Dent County, including Brooke Bergen, had drug problems with the opioids and meth primarily. So she goes in for the drug testing. She fails the drug test. And now the private probation company sends a note to the judge that Brooke has violated her pretrial release. She gets called before the judge, gets 10 days in jail, gets another bill for those 10 days in jail, and so on and so on. She gets called before the judge several times because the private probation company wants to drug test her, wants her to pay the money that she hasn't been able to afford to pay, etc. All from an $8 tube of mascara. Eventually, that year sentence that Brooke Bergen got that was suspended ended up being put in place by the judge. Brooke Bergen did a year in jail in Dent County for stealing a tube of mascara. And what was the result of that year in jail? Was her time with the criminal justice system over at that point? No, not at all. Because when she got out of that year in jail, she got a bill for her time in jail, $15,000. That wasn't the end either. Brooke Bergen couldn't afford to pay $15,000. At best, she had a minimum wage job when she was able to get one, when she was not involved in dealing with the criminal justice system. So the judge in Dent County and in similar counties all over Missouri would then call people like Brooke to have to go back to court once a month to deal with their situation. Either pay some money to the private probation company to pay down this jail bill, or go back to jail. And Brooke was threatened with jail over and over and over again until I started writing about her case and others. One of the other cases that I wrote about that really resonated with people is a gentleman named Cory Booth. When he was 17, Cory stole a lawnmower. Now, how many of us haven't done something when we were in our teenage years that might have gotten us tossed in jail? He stole a lawnmower. He was put in jail. He spent the night, Cory told me later, in jail with somebody who was there on felony bank robbery. And he'll never remember it because he'll never forget it because he was scared to death. Cory ends up getting a similar situation. He pleads guilty, gets a sentence for time served, doesn't have to go back to jail, but he gets a bill for his time in jail, and he's got to be supervised by the private probation company. Cory Booth, like Brooke Bergen, had a drug problem. In his case, he smoked marijuana. He ends up failing a drug test, ending up back in jail, and his bill from the criminal justice system keeps growing. Not because he's broken the law again, he didn't steal again, but he ran afoul of the private probation company. That got him back in jail, and then the county wanted their money for that time in jail. He lived on minimum wage jobs, still does, couldn't afford to pay that bill. And so when I met Cory, he had been going back to court once a month in Caldwell County for 10 years. He was 27 when I met him in 2018, and he had been trying to pay down his bill for 10 years, but in fact, it kept rising because every time he missed a court hearing because he couldn't get off work or had to take care of his kids, or every time he didn't have the money to pay the bill, he would go back in jail for another 5 days or 10 days or 30 days, and the bill would get bigger and bigger and bigger. This is the new American debtor's prison system. And it's not just in rural, poor counties. It is an element of what we learned about in Ferguson in 2014 after Michael Brown died on August 9th. I was the editorial page editor at the paper at the time, at the Post-Dispatch, and wrote editorial after editorial about the underlying causes of thousands upon thousands of young Black activists going to the street. They were protesting police brutality, but there was an underlying reason of why the angst and the anger was so intense in North St. Louis County. And that's because the county is broken into about 90 municipalities. Most of those municipalities don't have a strong tax base, and so they turn to traffic fines and fees to raise money. The victims of these schemes were young and Black. And similar to Brooke Bergen and Cory Booth, who were both white and poor, living in rural Missouri, these young Black poor people living in North St. Louis County couldn't afford to pay their driver's license suspensions and their fees and their fines that were stacked upon each other every time they went from one municipality to another. And they would get called to court, and they would get further warrants and fines if they missed a court date. And then they would end up jailed for that. That is one of the underlying causes of what created Ferguson as sort of a national hashtag. And this is the story of fines and fees and the criminal justice system trying to take a poverty penalty out of poor people all over the country. In cities, the victims are often poor and Black. In rural jurisdictions, they're often poor and white, but it is the same problem. And in 2017, when I started writing about this story, I was amazed at how unaware people outside of those jurisdictions were of this very pervasive American problem. But the people who were aware were the poor people who were the victims of it. One of them was a woman named Amy Murr, and I met her in Dent County when I was visiting one day for some court hearings. Her story was similar to Brooke's. She got arrested on some misdemeanors, ended up in jail, couldn't afford to pay the jail bill, and ended up back in jail again. And Amy asked me a story when we met one day. She said, "Why are you doing this? All these people that you're writing about, people like me," she said, "we're poor. Our community treats us like trash. Many of us have drug addictions, and we just get thrown away like pieces of dirt, like cattle counted as we're going into the jail. Why do you care about us? Why are you writing about us?" And I told Amy a story. It's a story from earlier in my life in Colorado. I was driving my son to an indoor soccer game in Arvada. And I don't know if the facility is still there. It was up somewhere off of Ward Road, I believe. And after the game, he asked if he could spend the night at a friend's house, and I said, sure. And so he went off with his friend, and I drove home. My older daughter was watching one of my younger children at that point, and so I was driving home to my other kids. And all of a sudden, I'm going south on Ward Road in Arvada, and I look up and I see sirens, lights, blue and red behind me. And I'm like, oh, I'm getting pulled over. I knew I wasn't speeding. I didn't have time to get up speeding. I had just turned around the corner. Maybe I didn't signal. So I pulled over. The police officer comes over, raps on my door. I roll down the window, and she says, "Can I have your license and registration, please?" And, you know, many of us have been through that before. I pull that information out and give it to the police officer. And she says, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Your tags are expired." Well, I was going through a divorce at the time, and I had forgotten to take care of that. My ex-wife got one car, I got one car, and I forgot to take care of, that important business. So I explained that to her, and she said, well, I'll go back to the police car and take care of it. So she goes back to her car, and I'm just sitting there waiting for her to come back, and it takes a while. And another police car shows up behind her. And eventually the two of them come up, and the first police officer asked me to get out of the car. Mr. Messenger, will you please get out of the car? And I said, excuse me? She said, do you know why you're being placed under arrest? And I said, no. She gets me out of the car, put my hands on the back of the trunk, and she handcuffs me and takes a hand on top of my head and pushes me into the back of her police car. And she says, did you know there was a warrant out for your arrest? And I said, I had no idea. What's it for? She says, I don't know yet. I'm waiting for the computer to come back. So I'm sitting handcuffed in a police car for the first time in my life. And eventually she comes back and she says, did you know that you forgot to pay a speeding ticket in Morrison? That's why you have a warrant out for your arrest. Well, if I were there in person, I know what I would see right now. I would see all of you nodding along with me. Anybody who's driven through Morrison knows that it's a speed trap. It's one of those places where on 74, the speed limit goes from 45 to 25, in a snap of a finger. And I got a speeding ticket there one time, and similar to my tags, put it in the glove compartment and forgot about it. So she says, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. Do you have any money to bail out? I said, well, my wallet's in the car. Why don't you go check? She goes and grabs my wallet. I have $80 in the wallet. She says, we're going to take you to the police station. I'm going to book you and fingerprint you and take your picture. And then you can pay this $80 to bail out. And that was it. I got out of there. I took care of my tags. I took care of my driver's license. And I told Amy Murr, as I'm explaining this story, there, but by the grace of God, go I. If I were poor and Black and lived in North St. Louis County, I would have ended up in jail that day. And I would have lost my children, and I would have lost my car. I was the executive editor of the Canyon Courier newspaper at that time, and the High Timber Times in Conifer, and the Columbine Community Courier in Littleton, which doesn't exist anymore. I would have lost my job. There would have been a story about me being arrested. If I were poor and white and lived in rural Missouri, all of those same bad things would have happened to me as well. I would have lost my job. I would have lost my kids, probably my car. These are the things that happen to poor people in America, be they Black and living in the city of St. Louis or white and living in rural counties, all over the country. It's a reality. It's a poverty penalty. And that's why I'm writing a book about this national problem. The title of the book, by the way, was going to be the title of this speech, The Price of Poverty. I'm finding out that book publishers change these things all the time. My book, which is being published by St. Martin's Press, comes out in December next year. And now it's being called Profit and Punishment: How America Criminalizes the Poor in the Name of Justice. And it's about this problem of fines and fees, not just jail board bills, but people, as you have in the state of Colorado and as your legislature has debated in the last couple of years, who get their driver's license suspended and then they can't go to work. Why do they get their driver's license suspended? Sometimes it's for failure to pay child support. Sometimes it's for failure to pay fines and fees in some of these other cases. In all of these cases, it is a poverty penalty. They are losing their driver's license because they were too poor to afford to pay other elements of the criminal justice system. And then the court, without due process, is taking away their right, their ability to go to work and actually pay for these fines. The punishment does not fit the crime. The Denver Post did a story recently about the state of fines and fees in Colorado and pointed out that in 2019, cities and counties in the state of Colorado tried to raise $132 million in fines and fees. Why are they doing this? They're doing this because lawmakers all over the country have stopped funding the criminal justice system. And when they find themselves in a need for money, they turn to fines and fees. And why is that? It happens in Missouri every single year. In fact, it happens in most states every year. A legislature can say, let's put a $3 fee on a misdemeanor or on a traffic ticket and charge it to every court in our jurisdiction. And I can go home after this vote and tell my voters that I didn't raise taxes. But in fact, you did. You raised taxes on poor people, the people who are can least afford to pay that bill. This is a travesty, and it's why people like Brooke Bergen and Cory Booth and Amy Murr end up in jail. They are the victims of this horrible system. One of the things that has happened because of COVID-19 is that it has clarified elements of our criminal justice system and how unfair they are toward poor people. In every state, we have people in prison, people in county jails, people in city jails who are contracting COVID. And some of them are dying. In Missouri, in the last month, we've had a death a day in our state prisons on average, some of them corrections officers, some of them people who were in jail. And many of these people who are dying are people who are there on pretrial detention. They haven't even been convicted of a crime yet. Almost everybody in America who's in jail on pretrial detention is there because they're poor, because they can't afford bail, because somebody who looks like me, who can wear a blazer, who can zoom in from a basement office, has enough money to be able to get out of jail if indeed I were ever arrested on a minor crime. We have to do better as a country in solving these problems. The good news is more and more people are starting to recognize it. You're seeing legislation in places like Colorado and Missouri and Oklahoma and South Carolina and Texas and Oregon and all over the country that are starting to address these issues. And on many of them, you can get Republicans and Democrats both to agree that the tyranny of big government putting poor people in jail, not because they're committing crimes, but because they have enough money to buy their freedom, is an injustice. The challenge is that ultimately we also have to convince lawmakers that the criminal justice system is not the reasonable place for them to impose their backdoor taxes, that poor people cannot continue to be the victims of the new American debtors' prisons in this country. I'm going to end there, and I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you again for dialing in and listening to this, and let's go ahead and answer some questions, Tiffany and Bob.
Great. Thank you, Tony. That was a powerful speech. I'm going to check and see if we have questions here. Again, you could submit them either through the Q&A or the chat box. Tony, I'll just lead with a question for you. Can you talk about your role in covering the incidents in Ferguson? What you learned from that from a journalistic perspective, and how it shaped your outlook and how you approach journalism?
So I used a phrase in my introduction that is something that I learned on the streets of Ferguson, and it's this idea of lived experience, of understanding that we all come from somewhere, and we all have certain backgrounds that allow us to understand the world around us. I grew up in Littleton, Colorado, a relatively white middle class affluent suburb. And that lived experience, sort of guided my life. What Ferguson really taught me is that we have to do a better job as journalists of listening to marginalized communities. And that means getting on the streets and seeing how they live and listening to their voices. In the case of Ferguson, not always taking a police narrative as dogma. We've seen over and over again since 2014, most recently in terms of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that the police narrative is often inaccurate. The victims of those inaccurate narratives in this country are often Black or other people of color or poor, and frequently all of those things. I write a lot about homelessness as well, and it's a similar sort of situation. You have to be willing to get on the street and meet people where they are, and let them tell you their story in a way that helps you frame the narrative from their perspective. I write a lot in my column about the Black perspective and about the poor person's perspective. And that only happens because I've spent enough time in those communities to have people that are willing to call me and email me and talk to me when they see me on the street and tell me their stories. And I think that's fundamentally a failure sometimes of journalism, is that we too often listen to the official sources who are quick with their news releases and quick with their emails and have our cell phones, and they build a narrative before we've actually talked to the people who are experiencing that narrative. And I think we should do a better job of letting them frame the story.
Great. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee. What's been most persuasive when talking to people about this issue? I'm assuming that this person is referring to debtors' prisons. Just the stories or something else?
So I think it's a combination of the personal stories. What really made this series have an impact in Missouri was that I found so many people in so many different counties who had a very similar experience to Brooke Bergen and Cory Booth. Specifically for people that are more on the right of the spectrum, I would regularly get emails from folks like that who would start their email saying, I normally disagree with you. Sometimes they would use stronger language than that. But I really understand and appreciate what you're writing about relating to these criminal justice problems. And I think a lot of it was sort of the tyranny of big government as it relates to people on the right understanding this. They understand backdoor taxes. And that's what so many of these fines and fees have become. They understand that putting poor people in jail primarily because they're poor does not make our community safer. And it hurts our economy because they can't work and their kids become the wards of the state, et cetera. And so I think people understood that idea that re-jailing people because they couldn't afford to pay a jail bill, they were shocked by that.
Okay. I have a question, another anonymous attendee. Are those types of policies regarding cash bail changed at the state level or county level? I think what they meant is have the policies regarding cash bail changed at the state or county level, probably I'm guessing in Missouri.
Well, all over the country, there's a section in my book that talks about this. All over the country, there are movements to require to either get rid of cash bail or at the very least require its more constitutional application, i.e., it is being applied in cases where you're trying to keep the community safe because the person is a threat to flee or a threat of violence to other people in the community. But reforming cash bail is a huge part of what we can do to fix this system as it relates to treating poor people fairly. And there's a lot of people in the movement, the criminal justice reform movement. There's an attorney named Alex Karakasanis who doesn't believe we need a whole lot of legislation. There are judges. It's happened in Missouri. The Supreme Court in Missouri has issued new rules on the application of cash bail, and they did so without legislation. They did so in part because they were spurred by a lawsuit filed by a nonprofit law firm called Arch City Defenders based in St. Louis. But the court itself is saying, you know what? you have to use apply the Constitution appropriately when charging cash bail. And that in and of itself has forced change in Missouri that is reducing jail populations in both the cities and rural areas. And so I think there's a lot of places where the courts can do it on their own. I think similar to the problem with fines and fees, ultimately having a legislature step in is probably the best way to go, or we might end up in a lot of places. California has been debating a proposition. I believe it failed on election day, but there's a variety of ways to change. The first and quickest way is for judges to just start following the law and the Constitution.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Don Burns. You talk about stories, and you told us 3 of them. How do we find these kinds of useful stories? I think what he meant to say is, how do we find these stories useful if we are not journalists?
There are, I think part of it is using your organization, CCLP, and the ACLU has become very active in this movement. I know that they've been active in Colorado in identifying some of these cases. I think it's a matter of finding partners that care about lifting people up out of poverty and working together to elevate these stories. So an example here in Missouri, we have the ACLU and the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity organization, working together to try to reform fines and fees because both organizations on the left and the right find it offensive the way it's being applied in Missouri to keep poor people in jail. So I think part of that is just reaching out to similar organizations and finding attorneys who are willing to talk about what they see in courts. The best resource in my series on debtors' prisons in Missouri was the public defender's office. The public defenders know what's going on. Some of them, unfortunately, feel like they just don't have the political power to speak out against the judges that they have to appear before every day, against prosecutors who are pretty aggressive and want them to just help move people through the system. But the public defenders are a tremendous source of information on these cases. One of the things I did in my reporting and trying to find people here is I used our court system, which is called CaseNet, and just went to counties and searched for cases that were really old, like 10 years old, that ended up still having hearings going forward, because that was a sign, a symptom of something wrong. And that's how I found Cory Booth, for instance. I did a search, found a case that was 10 years old, went and looked at the original charge, and it was stealing a lawnmower. And why in the heck was this guy still going to court 10 years later?
I have a really good question from a couple of colleagues. It's pretty much the same question about the how much of this problem is being driven by for-profit probation and debt collection companies. That's a variation of the question from my colleague, Sarah Lipowitz from CCLP. She's our public benefits attorney. But again, how much of the problem is being driven by for-profit probation and debt collection companies?
It's both. It's the combination of the for-profit probation companies and the government entities that are seeking revenue. So going back to Ferguson, one of the things that I wrote about was there were specific police chiefs and mayors who got caught sending letters and emails to their police officers trying to implement arrest quotas, saying our budget depends on you arresting more people, get to it or your job is on the line. The same thing is happening in some county jurisdictions where you have a presiding county commissioner or a county commission or a county executive, depending on the form of government, and you have a sheriff who's frequently the most powerful sort of political person in these rural counties, and they need money. And the way they get money is they put more people in jail. And then what do? They end up with overcrowding in their jail, and they go to taxpayers and say, we need a bigger jail. And they pitch it as a public safety issue, but it's not. Here's one of the things we need to do to help turn this issue around. And there's only been one major study out of, I think it was out of Kentucky, that really looked at this issue that basically said, if you're keeping people in jail longer, particularly pre-trial, particularly on misdemeanors, you're actually having a negative effect on public safety than you would if you release them, they went home, they could take care of their families, do their jobs, do all the things that people with money do when they're able to bail out and not have to be stuck in jail while they're awaiting trial on charges that may or may not be bogus. So the profit motive is a government profit motive, and the private probation companies feed that, and they feed off of each other. The reason we have private probation companies is because state legislatures who used to fund parole officers, at least this is the story in Missouri, they still fund parole officers and probation officers for people accused of felonies, but they stopped doing it for misdemeanors because they didn't have the money. So they cut it. So these private companies came in, and now they work hand in hand with the judges to just try to make sure that they're both getting paid.
Great. I have one more question in the Q&A box. I'm going to put my colleague, Bruce Barnum, CCLP's development director, on the spot a little bit. I can't see the chat feature from my dashboard. Are there any questions on the chat feature that you'd like to bring into the spotlight? Bruce? Okay. I'm not sure if Bruce heard that, and that's okay. I guess there are no questions in the chat feature. I do have one more question for you. Can you again tell us the name of your upcoming book and its expected release?
Sure. The book is called Profit and Punishment: How America Criminalizes the Poor in the Name of Justice. It is being published by St. Martin's Press, and it is going to come out in December of 2021. And if you follow my my Twitter account, which is at Tony Mess, TonyMess, I'll be making sure that I link to places where you can buy the book and all of that. And I also link to lots of different sources on that Twitter account, not just of my columns on criminal justice reform and poverty, but lots of writers all over the country who are addressing these issues.
Thanks again, Tony. Great, great
Excuse me,
presentation.
Bob, there is someone with their hand raised in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going through, Bob, the questions in the chat here to see what Tony already covered. There's one we didn't necessarily get into as much. So someone asked Tony, do you know which states, you talk mostly about Missouri and a little bit about Colorado, use these methods? And also the question asked specifically, are there counties and local jurisdictions in Colorado that are doing this right now? You mentioned Morrison, and maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
So every state in the country is bad. I have not yet found a state that doesn't have multiple jurisdictions that do this, that treat poor people properly. California is coming closer on bail. They're sort of leading the way on bail. New York and New Jersey are having some start and stop moments as it relates to bail reform that are relatively positive. In my book, I write extensively about Missouri, about Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of the worst states in the country as it relates to fines and fees and their application on poor people. And it's similar to Missouri, where the victims are poor and Black in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and poor and white in most of the rural counties. South Carolina's particularly egregious, as is Alabama, Mississippi, many of the southern states. One of the states that's also making some progress, in part because of a conservative organization called Right on Crime, is Texas. Texas has passed some driver's license reform so that they are reducing the ability of the state to just automatically suspend driver's licenses for failure to pay fines and fees. There really is a movement of all of the different elements of criminalizing the poor through the courts. The greatest area for movement, I think, that in which there's legislation in multiple states, including Colorado, is this idea that we need to stop suspending driver's licenses because people can't afford to pay their fines and fees. I think there's a real good opportunity for that issue to move forward and become something that gets changed a lot in the next couple of years. But I know, for instance, just from a couple of cases that I've read about, this is a problem in Aurora, Colorado. This is a problem in a couple of the rural counties around Elbert County, where my dad lives, in which people are getting their driver's licenses suspended because of their failure to pay fines and fees. And then they don't have an ability to go to work unless they're going to break the law. And then they end up with more serious legal repercussions.
Well, thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tony.
You're welcome.
One other one in the chat. I'm going to
one.
paraphrase this one a little bit. So hopefully I capture the meaning of it properly here. It's from Miller Hudson. So let me know if I didn't get it right. But I believe he's asking, the folks that you've talked to who have really been kind of the victims of, the systemic oppression, what's sort of their view on, democracy and government, and especially, particularly the governments that they've interacted with that have, sort of preyed on them. Are they likely to vote? I mean, I think he's kind of trying to ask, what is their view of sort of the civic fabric, if you will.
Well, most of the people that I talk to who live in those communities and continue to live in those communities, they feel abandoned. They feel like the system has left them behind, and so they don't trust the system. Some of them specifically can't vote because they're back in jail or prison, either because of some of their underlying drug issues or just because maybe not the system's out to get them. Definitely, I spend far too much money using the JPay app to correspond with people that I've written about who are in jail or prison right now. And part of it is because, what's that old saying? Just because I think they're out to get me doesn't mean they aren't. A lot of those folks that I talk to just don't really believe that the system exists for them, that it exists for people with money, but not people who just can't afford to buy their way to freedom.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, Bob, that's everything I see in the chat box that wasn't covered from your previous questions.
I'm seeing the chat box now. Tony, I wish that you had a full room here, that you could hear the thunderous applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, all of the participants today. It's a pleasure working with you and catching up with you over the past year or so. So thank you. Tiffany now will begin to wind down the session with a few words about our board match challenge, and then I'll recognize our sponsors and we can begin putting a fork in it, so to speak.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much for being with us today, Tony. I really enjoyed listening to you, and it's a reminder of all the many challenges that remain. In fact, this movement can feel like we take 2 steps forward for every 1 step back. Sometimes it may even feel like we take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And frankly, this is why those that are participating in today's session do not want to miss tomorrow's segment. We have a lived experience project that is incredibly powerful. It's a reminder of why we do this work and why this work really is worth the fight. The lived experience video starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow, so do not miss it. And at 11 a.m., we have the much anticipated State of Working Colorado report. It will be unveiled, and CCLP researcher Charlie Brennan will offer an overview of Colorado's workforce and the impact of COVID on Colorado's workforce. So be sure to join us for those segments. I would also like to extend a special thank you to Colorado Children's Campaign, Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, BARD, the Wheeler Advisory Group, Community Resource Center, Colorado Fiscal Institute, Interfaith Alliance, the Aloha Foundation, Connect for Health, Parity Lowry Lesbeck Attorneys at Law, the League of Women Voters, Center for Work Education and Employment, Colorado Access, the Center for African American Health, and of course, our CCLP Board of Directors. Your sponsorship, your support of this event has meant a tremendous amount to us, and we could not do this without you. You know, community means that we all have a responsibility to make a positive difference. And I would like to ask you to accept a responsibility in advancing the anti-poverty movement. If you've never given money to CCLP before, I would like to ask you to join us as a monthly donor at just $10 a month. If we receive just 10 new reoccurring monthly donors, it means that we can provide translation services, ensuring that important topics such as eviction prevention, and that's just one example, it's important that these topics are translated into Spanish. And so if you can give whatever dollar amount that is, it really helps us to ensure that we are moving this agenda forward. And I'm proud that CCLP, that we ensure more than 85 cents on every dollar goes directly to the programs that we provide. You will find no better stewards of your dollars. The board match is even more incentive. As a reminder, the board has put together a pot of money, $10,000, that they will offer as a match to any and all donations that come in during the event. Whatever you can give, every dollar truly does help. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you tomorrow.
Yes, I'd like to say a few more words before capping it. Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, everyone. With all the heaviness in the world and some of the subject matter we've been discussing throughout this virtual event, we will kind of kick off our, I guess you would say, kick off our shoes. I don't know, it's winter, we're not gonna, or it's fall, we're not gonna kick off our shoes, but the CCLP happy hour at 4 p.m. Not sure what to expect from this, but should be a little more fun, a little more levity, and it is Friday after all. So be sure to dial in for that. Tomorrow is our final day, and as Tiffany mentioned, we're going to be showing our project video from Lived Experience that Andrea Metcalf put together as our summer fellow from Colorado College. That's a pretty powerful piece. At 11, we'll be previewing our State of Working Colorado report. That's our kind of semi-annual compendium of how the economy is working for Colorado's workers. This time it includes some data from the COVID-19 era, so that should be very illuminating. Charlie Brennan, our Deputy Director of Research, will be hosting and moderating that. And I think that's about it. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, All of the content from the 3 days of Communities Against Poverty will be posted on our YouTube channel. It will be shared on our social media networks, and we will post it on our website as well. So if you miss any part of the segment, or you want to go back and review, or you want to share, all of it, except for the happy hour, will be available. So I would again like to thank our sponsors, as Tiffany did, both presenting and supporting, particularly those who supported the keynote, the Colorado Access Center for African American Studies and Connect for Health Colorado. And thank you for making this virtual event and our work possible. And yeah, we're closing out for the early afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great evening, or afternoon through evening. Thanks again.